Soon enough, our conversation is going to be interrupted by the phone ringing, and it's going to be from Sweden offering me the Nobel Peace Prize for this genius idea.
Hey there, I'm Stefan Kesting, and this is the Strenuous Life Podcast. Ladies and gentlemen, today I have got a treat for you. One of my favorite human beings, the history professor, the martial artist, the Aikido apologist, the creator. Well, ever since we did that video together, you are forever the Aikido apologist.
Totally resent that.
And the creator of the History on Fire podcast, which is one of my favorites. Whenever you put out a new episode, I drop everything and I listen to it. So welcome, Daniele Bolelli.
Thanks, man. The Aikido apologist. I'll have to beat you up for that. Well, okay, I'll hire somebody else to beat you up for it.
I think Nikio to Sankyo would be my Achilles heel, just so you know.
That's the way to go, I say.
Yeah. So first, I want to start out by talking about the podcast that you've been doing. This is your second time on my podcast, but you've got your own podcast as well, or actually several.
Yep.
The History on Fire is the one that I'm most familiar with, and you've really ramped up your production on that. You're producing them, is it every month now?
Yeah, it's one a month, because, I mean, really the one a month is, I wanted to do close to one a month, but not quite because the research is brutal. But then I got a sponsorship where they asked me to do one a month, and I'm like, okay, crank down, do what you got to do, make it happen. The main issue is just it's a monstrous amount of research, so it goes crazy number of hours go in preparation for each episode, because I really need to know the topic up and down, back and forth before I release anything on it.
Well, just to give us some context, I mean, one of the last series you did was the Conquest of Mexico.
Yep.
So how many sources would you have been going to for that? That was a 3-part series, right?
The one was 4 parts. I read probably 15 books on the topic. So each book is your 300-400 page kind of thing. So you're looking at probably 6,000 pages to read, then summarize them, put them together in a way that makes sense. By the end, my notes for it were about 40-50 pages single-spaced. So it's a lot of stuff.
Yeah. So you're old school and you keep paper notes.
Yeah, I do. I mean, I don't read per se. Like, I want to keep, because otherwise the delivery gets really boring if it sounds like you're reading something. But I do have very extensive notes on it so that I have them next to me that I can peek at, so I know where I want to go next.
It's funny, I've played with various note-taking apps and list apps and, keep track of your life apps, but I always seem to come back to paper. I think I'm just a little bit Luddite in that area.
My handwriting is so horrible. I mean, I understand it. I think I'm the only human who understands it, because everyone else thinks it's like I could be a spy or something, because nobody can read what I write.
Well, nobody could read Leonardo da Vinci's writing either. Of course, he was a mirror script.
Yes.
So maybe
I take that as a compliment, even though probably it's not meant that way by the people who are like, how the hell do you write like that? But I'll take it. Then again, nobody when I speak English understands me speaking either. So I think everybody has their idea of what I'm saying or what I'm writing, and maybe it's a good thing that they can project their fantasies on what I'm doing as opposed to actually figuring out what I'm actually doing.
You're a blank canvas, sir, that people can project their fantasies onto.
Yes.
Well, it's actually way more than that. I'm talking to various people. They're really enjoying your podcast.
Sweet.
So you read like 15 books. Or however many books are available on the topic. I think your last one about the Pirate Queen of China, there wasn't as much source material there.
Exactly. That's why I did it in one episode, because there was only so much I could keep them going with.
And then you make your notes as you're going through.
Yep.
And then you're going to sit down to record it. Do you actually have a point form skeleton of what you're going to be talking about? How do you keep it all organized and keep where you are?
Yeah, I have a pretty detailed outline. It's kind of like when I lecture in class, when I teach history. I have a pretty detailed outline of what I want to cover. I'm not reading it, that way I still keep the delivery fresh and it feels like conversation. But I always have a sense of what's coming up next. And, especially if there are quotes I want to use, I have them written out or, things like that.
So when you teach, you're not one of these people who puts up a PowerPoint with an entire paragraph of text and then reads it from beginning to end and then moves on to the next slide?
Yeah, I hate PowerPoints. To me, it's like, they can be done, the images could be cool to give a visual for what you're talking about. I don't mind that part. But a lot of PowerPoints is just lazy teaching.
And I think it's a way to take mediocre or poor teachers and make them semi-acceptable, because at least you know you're going to cover the material because it's on the slides.
Exactly, which tells you something about the quality.
Yeah, some of the best talks I've seen are either just somebody standing up there on stage talking, or their PowerPoints are 100% visuals without any text at all.
Yeah.
So then how long does it take you to record if your podcast is going to be 2 hours long, what's kind of your recording to actual finished product ratio?
It doesn't take that much to record, because by the time I have all my notes together, I really know what I'm going to say and what the whole thing is going to be like. So it's probably 3 hours of recording to get a 2-hour episode. And then I pass the ball to the sweet Savannah M. She's going to start taking care of all the editing and putting together the art for the episode cover and all that kind of stuff.
So then at least you don't have to sit in front of a computer and slice and dice and adjust levels and all that sort of thing.
That's what she does, and I'm very grateful for that.
I suppose it's made easier by the fact that, in some sense, you talk for a living, being a teacher.
Mm-hmm. I'm used to that game. I'm used to just put the quarter in the jukebox and I start talking and off we go. Any topic you want, let's go.
Well, it's also a useful skill for podcasting, turns out.
Yeah, not a bad gig.
So when you are teaching, you're known for a couple different things. You're known for your involvement in the martial arts and mixed martial arts, and you're known for your involvement with your podcasting. What do students come up to you and talk more about? Do they recognize you before they get to your class, or do they come to your class because of one thing or the other, or because of the Drunken Taoist podcast? What is it that brings them to you?
I think it's a mix. I mean, some people know me already, many people do not, and so it varies. It varies a lot. I mean, primarily the ones who do know me is probably because either have listened to my podcast or maybe they have seen me on Joe Rogan podcast or some of the big famous one like that. But that's about it. Occasionally there's somebody who read a book I wrote, not super often, but it happens. But I think the majority, the bulk of the people don't know me beforehand.
And do you, I guess you can't really pimp your podcast to them, or do you say, if you're interested in this topic, check out History on Fire? Totally,
because sometime, in class I'll cover a topic quickly, 10 minutes version of it, and then I'll tell them, if you're interested in more, okay, I talk about Crazy Horse for 10 minutes. It's a cool story, but I don't want to kill you with details in a classroom setting. But if you do dig the topic, here is 7 hours on the topic, where I just 4 episodes, 2 hours each almost, and it's up there, it's free, you want to check it out, it's yours.
Well, it's a nice variation on what I went through when I was in university, which was some chemistry professor, say, who had written a book on chemistry and needed to be guaranteed of at least 300 sales a year. So he would make it mandatory reading for some giant class that he was teaching. Probably he'd signed up for the giant class just to make sure that people would buy the stupid book.
Yeah, because they can keep you as a captive audience, forcing you to buy their $120 textbook.
Mm-hmm.
That's a scam right there.
So you're proposing that they go listen to your free podcast. That's very nice of you.
Yeah, I need to figure out a better scam, because that's not working well. I suggest you listen to this free thing. It's like, yeah, I need to rethink my inner capitalist is failing.
What do you think of the Dan Carlin model, where he releases a new podcast in the history space, and then he removes one of the older podcasts, and so then everything that's more than 10 episodes old becomes a paid item? It's a very interesting model that I hadn't seen before in the podcasting space.
Yeah, I'm gonna do this. I mean, I have a couple of episodes retired already. I'll do the same thing. I think I'll retire a few more as time goes by, and I'll probably leave the first 2 or 3 forever, just out of curiosity to see how many downloads they get lifetime-wise. But then I'll progressively, from like 4 forward, I'll do the Dan Carlin approach and see how it goes. Because the reality is, when the number of people who donate to a podcast is always at 0.5% of people who actually listen. So you can't really rely on pure donations. Donations are sweet, they are nice, but they are not going to keep the lights on for very long. You need to figure out other ways to make it work. Ads can work, but then especially when a bunch of ad company wants you to put the ad in the middle of an episode, and that's kind of, I don't know, man. I'm struggling with that. Like, unless I really, really have to, I would rather avoid that. So maybe selling all the episodes is a good way to go. It's a decent compromise. I'm not sure. I'm trying to figure out how to make it economically viable so that it makes sense without having to compromise the actual content.
Well, we're really getting super off topic here, but that's okay. It's my podcast. If people don't like it, they can get their money back. But one thing that Dan Carlin, because I know he hangs on my every word about podcasting, that's a joke, could do a better job of is making people aware that the older episodes are for sale. Because I can't tell you the number of people I've talked to who've gone, that was a really awesome episode. And I go, well, you should check out this other episode. And they just have no idea that it exists. So his monetization of his back catalog could be better done.
Dan is the worst salesman on the planet by his own admission. He's just not in it for the money. And, he's doing a great job. He's managing to make a living on it anyway. So good for him. But you can clearly tell that this is a guy who's not there for the money, who just wants to get to do his job and do it well. And he almost feels weird about bringing money into the equation.
So we talked a bit about the Savannah M Factor here, who's editing your podcast, but she's also, in big breaking news, you just told me, signed a contract with ONE FC. So it's a full contact family that you've got going there.
Yeah, she's going to be fighting in Asia, and it's exciting because it's a big step up. And yeah, she's going to be fighting for one championship, probably, I don't know, anywhere from December to, that's the earliest, or maybe the beginning of 2018. She's very excited because, I don't know, I like ONE as an organization. They seem really cool. Their weight cutting policy is the best in the business because they don't let you dehydrate yourself, which is great for long-term kidney function.
How do they enforce that?
They basically, I don't know exactly how they weigh you, but they weigh you for 2 months. You have to hit certain marks. You can't gain more than a certain fairly small amount of weight compared to your fighting weight. So let's say if you fight at 135, I don't think you can go over 145. And then you diet. And the last weigh-in is 3 hours before the fight. You have to keep, and they have they check to make sure that your body is not dehydrated at any point. And they don't allow you to use dehydration as a way to cut weight.
See, I'd always assumed the reason that the UFC had the weigh-in the day before was so that it would give them a little bit of leeway. If I'm fighting and I come in and I'm 5 pounds over, they can go, oh, okay, well, back into the sauna with you. Whereas if I show up, if they do the weigh-in 2 hours before the fight, they just don't have that slack anymore. There is no time left to adjust the weight.
But the fact that they do weigh you for a good 2 months beforehand is it's basically forcing you to just be good about your diet, and that's it. If you're taking care of your diet and making sure you're staying within that range, and you don't need to cut that much weight. So, if you're off by a couple of pounds, you're like, okay, I need to work harder for the next week, lose the couple, and you do it over 2 months. There shouldn't really be too many surprises. It's kind of a no-brainer. I mean, it's weird that not all MMA organizations are using the ONE model because it's simple, it works. Every other UFC event, somebody's canceling fights because they can't make weight or they got sick from dehydrating too much or some crap is going on. It's completely takes away from the sport. It's just demented model. And it's not UFC's fault alone because everybody does that. It's just...
boxing, kickboxing, Thai boxing.
ONE, I think the only reason why it changed is because they had a guy die on them. This guy got a fight on short notice. He tried to cut 30 pounds in a week, died. And at that point, they were like, okay, we're not doing this anymore. We are going to make sure that we do something that's healthier for the fighters. And they created this model, and I think it's genius.
Did he die in the ring or die in the sauna?
No, died beforehand because he was just squeezed this body way beyond his capabilities. And, you've seen a lot of guys recently who are dangerously flirting with that boundary because I've seen guys who can't get on the scale. People are literally carrying them to the scale. It's just like, dude, what are you doing to your body? That's insane.
Well, it's one of those things where it's the devil's bargain. A lot of those guys wouldn't do it if everybody else wasn't doing it. But if everybody else is doing it, then you probably should be doing it as well.
Exactly. It's like steroids, right? If it's legal and everybody can do it, then if you don't do it, you have no business being in the cage because you're going to get crushed by somebody who trains just as hard as you and on top of it is on the best steroids out there. The point is, because it's not healthy for you, you want to then make it where nobody's doing stuff that give them a competitive edge at the price of one's health. Which is why I don't understand why they have all this big campaign against steroids, but they are totally fine with people cutting weight in the unhealthiest ways possible.
Well, I thought they cracked down on it a little bit in the UFC because they now test, I believe, for plasticizers. And plasticizers would be essentially the things that keep the plastic bags that hold the IV fluids soft. And so you're not, in theory, allowed to use an IV to rehydrate. And that was a big part of, you dehydrate yourself just unto death, and then they stick a needle in your arm, or your team sticks a needle in your arm, and you are able to absorb way more fluid than you would if you weren't using an IV. So I think they've made that illegal. I think that's still illegal. Of course, there's probably somebody using a glass bottle and a vein from a pig and a hollowed out porcupine quill to inject it into their veins. Ha, you're not testing for porcupine quill.
Yeah, now that model is insane. I mean, really, the stuff that... And, you can, in the short term, you can be okay, but long term, you are taking damage to your kidneys doing that. There's just no way about it. Really not a good idea.
Your kidneys, which are getting pounded with punches and kicks and knees and slams. It also affects the brain. The dehydration makes your brain more vulnerable to concussion, and then I can only imagine that amplifies the whole CTE problem.
Yep.
The chronic traumatic encephalopathy. Hey, that's a $5 word.
Check you out.
Yeah. So what else is different about ONE FC?
Their philosophy, the way it's stated, is interesting because they tend to discourage trash talking. They have this more sort of romantic view of martial arts that's about honor and respect, and they don't want to market trash talking. They want to market kind of good athletes who are seen as quote unquote good role models as opposed to the WWE model.
Mm-hmm.
So that part is interesting. The fact that one thing I don't like is they allow soccer kicks, which I'm not a fan of. I understand the knees to the down opponent. That makes sense in terms of people who are shooting all the time, just praying to land it. Soccer kicks, I don't like, but to each their own. What else? Their cage is not an octagon, is round, is a circle. Trying to think of other stuff. They're all over Asia, basically. They're doing events in just about every other Asian country. And I don't know, I dig it. It's right now it seemed like it made perfect sense for her. She's Cambodian American, they like the idea of having fighters who look like the people who are gonna go to the events in these countries. So it seemed like a good match.
I wonder why, and I've got some theories, but maybe you have theories as well, why mixed martial arts was so much slower to take off in most of Asia. It took off in Japan, but really not in very many other places. I mean, in China, it's just getting started with that whole debacle about the MMA guy taking out all those Tai Chi masters.
Yeah, a lot of Asia has not been big in MMA yet. And I think ONE is playing a huge role in changing that, because a lot of their fighters are locals.
Do you think it's a lack of wrestling tradition? Maybe, although there are indigenous wrestling styles all over the world.
Wrestling is a big deal for sure, because it's one of the key elements of the game. That's part of it. Part of it could be also organization. I mean, in some places, everybody goes watch Muay Thai, for example. That's what you care for. So there's less of a desire to branch out, or at least it takes a while to have another combat sports that can rival. When you already have a big combat sport that's so successful, it wasn't as easy to pitch a new one. But I think it's happening now. It looks like there are more and more events taking place, not even just one that is the big event, but also a lot of smaller ones are beginning to happen in those countries.
And how is the level of the groundwork, and for lack of a better term, we'll say jiu-jitsu or the grappling in those countries?
Good. Some really good people. Then, I mean, there are stars that are kind of Asian Americans who go there. Like, I don't know if you ever saw Angela Lee fight. She's the champion at 115 for ONE. Jesus, her jiu-jitsu is beautiful to watch. She hit a twister in an MMA fight, which is something not many people have done. She moves super smoothly. She's a really good fighter.
Well, hopefully Savannah's the same thing, right? She's essentially American, but she'll have a very strong draw there.
Exactly.
And have you guys given thought to the time zones? Like, I doubt they're going to fly you in 2 weeks before a fight. So now you're flying in, and not only are you doing your final little weight cut and dealing with all the stress of a fight, but you're also getting off a plane after flying for 12 hours, 13 hours, 16 hours.
Yeah, that's gonna suck. There's just no argument there that that's gonna be rough on the body. One advantage, I guess, is that Savannah is able to fall asleep in just about every circumstance. So day, night, doesn't matter. She'll lay down and sleep, which helps in trying to deal with jet lag, because she can just lay down, take a nap, 3-hour nap before, so that helps a little. But of course, it's still, flying across the globe is hard on the body, for sure.
Yeah, your circadian rhythm's completely off, even if you're not exhausted. Whereas I'm exhausted and my circadian rhythm is off because I don't have that superpower to be able to fall asleep unless it's completely dark and I'm completely horizontal and it's completely quiet.
Exactly.
So
I'm with you. So I don't understand that superhuman power.
Well, maybe you should only fly Emirates,
right?
And get one of those $20,000 private rooms, essentially.
Right, not a bad gig.
I've often wondered what would happen if you had an airline that was crossing the Atlantic or the Pacific, any one of these long-haul flights. Could you squeeze enough bunk beds in there so that you'd have to stay horizontal for the whole time? Would you be able to fill the plane up with the same number of people if everyone's lying flat, one on top of each other, in either bunk beds type scenario or like those Japanese coffin hotels, those little tiny rooms?
Or you should just open the orgy airline, where just they are literally on top of each other, in the sense that for the next 10 hours it's just one wild orgy. Then again, it sounds a lot cooler in my fantasy than when I look at the people around me on the plane most of the time. I'm like, yeah, probably not.
I haven't seen it, but I've seen, there was a documentary on the swinger lifestyle.
Mm-hmm.
And I just saw stills from it that people were delighting and posting on Facebook because, of course, they were the least attractive people you've ever seen.
Of course.
Maybe that was for effect. Maybe there's a really hot swinger club or swinger circle. This was the definitely not hot swinger circle.
Hey, ugly people need sex too.
Yes, but not on a plane and not with me.
I signed that. Yeah, I agree.
Basically, it's like spandex. Only I should be allowed to determine who's allowed to wear spandex or not. It would be a very difficult job. It'd be a lot of people to review, but somebody has to do it. And eventually they can just have some machine learning algorithm that would learn my rulings and be able to apply them across the globe before taking over and killing everyone Terminator style.
Yeah, that's the problem with the machine algorithm.
So how's your own training going? Because, of course, on top of everything else, you're also doing jiu-jitsu and doing MMA and those sorts of things.
I mean, it's all right. I never get... The reality is, way back when, I knew that I would never have the time to put in where that would be desirable when you're training intensely in a martial arts. I would never have the 6 days a week, the 5 days a week, that kind of stuff. So very early I had to make a choice. It's like, am I okay with the fact that my progress is going to be probably a lot slower than other people, because I will be able to train 3 times a week on a really good period. More often than not, it's going to be 2 times a week, sometimes even once a week, which is, really crap training compared to what you could and should have to improve. But the option is, well, it's either that or it's nothing. So take your pick. Are you okay with the fact that you're not going to be able to put in the time you would want? And, I kind of made my peace with it, that I was like, yeah, that's fine. It's better than 0 times a week. So I'm up for it. And so that's kind of where it's at. I'm doing a little bit of judo and jiu-jitsu a couple of times a week. And, classic, nice, slow progress that you're going to have with a couple of times a week, where you're not going to be able to, That's why when people ask on the mat, how many years have you been rolling? It's like, it doesn't mean shit, because I can have rolled 15 years, but if I do it twice a week, it's very different from the 5 years of the next guy who's in the gym morning at night, twice a day, 7 days a week,
Plus, they've had 15 years to forget stuff.
Right, exactly.
So, there's water coming into that cup, but there's also water seeping out of the bottom of that cup all the time.
Of course. So, but it's cool. I enjoy it. That's kind of what it's about. It's not that I'm not gonna be doing it professionally anytime soon. So it's like, it's cool. I'm having a good time with it.
But you did have some amateur fights.
Yeah. No, I did it, exactly. And I'm glad I did it when I did, with the average level sucked a lot more than it does today. today the average level when you go. Well, I even had a couple pro fights, if you want to call them that. But they were against, like, the guy who has a good jiu-jitsu and has no idea what he's doing with his hands or wrestling, or the guy who is a decent striker but who has no wrestling whatsoever and barely any jiu-jitsu. It's kind of like the equivalent of 1994 UFC type of stuff. And, against that level, sure, I could handle it. But, I definitely wouldn't want to get in the cage against people who are really putting their 6 times a week with my 2 times a week.
Well, the volume of training that people are doing now is just crazy. The level of professionalism, even for people competing at the Blue Belt Worlds, you're essentially talking professional athletes who are already training 6 hours a day, 4, 5, 6 times a week.
Yeah, that's nuts. That's like, because especially, who the hell can afford it? Because there is no money at that level. There is no money at many levels above your level. So it's like, how the hell do you afford to put in that many hours a week? You either better have married rich or have inherited something, or I don't know what the hell, because that looks really difficult to make it happen on a practical level.
Well, just like the best thing that you can do to improve your strength, agility, endurance, and coordination is to have picked the right parents.
Yeah.
And thus have the right genetic predisposition for the sport. Perhaps that also applies to the financial end of things. It'd be interesting to see. I mean, I know some guys who are training professionally and being supported by their girlfriends. And so maybe that's how that's done sometimes. Again, nice work if you can get it.
Or, I guess the other thing is somebody may not have that much money. They may have their job that kind of barely keeps them afloat, but they have one passion in life. And that is just train jiu-jitsu or Muay Thai or whatever. And there's nothing else going on. They don't care about anything else. So every little ounce of free time, they put it into that one passion. Then I think you can still do it, even if you're not rolling around in gold. The problem with me is that I'm too spread out. I like too many things. I have too many things that I'm dedicated to. I don't have just one single passion where every single free minute I have I'll dedicate to. I have several. And so that doesn't really work if you want to, at a competitive level, if you're trying to compete with somebody else who's putting all their time in it, it's not going to work very well.
What would be the other big boxes of your life?
Well, beside work, where I teach 2 different schools more than full-time when you consider the amount of hours I put into. I have 3 courses in one school, 3 courses in another. History on Fire is a full-time job all by itself, just the amount of research done. On top of it, I do the other podcast, The Drunken Taoist. There are multiple writing projects that I'm usually working on at the same time, kind of just juggling one between another. I have a daughter to take care of. Working out, martial arts, that kind of thing. Right there, it's a good start.
And I see, because we're Facebook friends, that you're also doing a fair bit of traveling.
Yeah, not crazy amount, but yeah, I do, especially in summer.
So you go back to Italy how often?
I go every year. In summer, I go. Summer to me is sacred. Summer is vacation, I'll still do History on Fire, I'll still do stuff like that, but I like to have a break, so I go back to Italy. Maybe I'll squeeze in another trip somewhere, but yeah, that's what I do.
Where in Italy do you go?
My family is from Milan. This summer I was so happy because I got to go to the sea in Italy, in Tuscany, and it was just beautiful. Got to spend a week there, and I was like, man, why don't I do this more? This is so healthy, so I can plug in from a lot of obligations and just spending a week on the beach where all you got to think about is sleep, eat, hang out by the beach, go for a swim, read a book on the sand, play. Oh, man, that feels so damn good.
Well, it's an interesting phenomenon when you become a tourist in your own home city or where you were raised. I grew up in Toronto, and when I go back there, I'm usually not working. I'm definitely not in school. It's almost 100% tourist in my own city. My parents don't live there anymore. And I get to discover the little cool corners that I never got to do when I was living there, because I was living there and working there and going to school there. And I've had similar experiences going back to other areas that I used to work in or live in, and going back just as a tourist going back purely to do all those things is a very, very different experience. I imagine it's the same for you. When you were growing up in Italy, you didn't have time to go to the beach on a regular basis and just sleep and eat and swim and play.
Yeah, I like Italy a lot better now than I did when I used to live there. Because, when you live, it's like with anything. When you have something available all the time, you sort of take it for granted. When you don't, you look at it with new eyes, and it's a lot more intriguing and more fun. So I really like Italy so much better now than I did when I used to live there.
And you haven't yet well, you did in your early History on Fire episodes go the whole Roman and slave rebellion route, but you haven't done anything majorly Roman recently.
Yeah, I have a bunch of good topics related to it, so I will definitely do it again. I did do, there were a couple of stories that were Italian, I guess. I mean,
later, Renaissance.
Yeah, either that or very early. Like the 4,000 years ago guy found in the Alps. That one was pretty cool, yeah, Ozzy. So I've done a couple of those stories. But yeah, I will probably do some Roman history in a not too distant future.
Is the consensus now with Ötzi that he was killed by an arrow?
Well, I mean, the guy got bashed in a bunch of ways. He got shot by an arrow that would have caused his death very quickly. His head got also bashed in, either because he fell from the arrow and bashed his head, or because somebody walked up to him and used a giant rock to bash his skull in. So somebody killed him. Either the arrow finished the job, or the fall/rock on the head finished the job. But yeah, somebody killed him. There's no argument about that.
Which kind of brings me to a big topic that I wanted to talk about with you, and that's this whole idea of how violent was history. History defined as time before now. Because I've read, and you've read, books like The War Before Civilization, which argues that it was incredibly violent. And of course, the opposite view is the whole noble savage thing, that everything was unicorns and rainbows, and then the white man arrived, and that's what made, warrior was a philosophical position.
Yeah.
And so where in between those two extremes do you fall, and what was the homicide rate, 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, 10,000 years ago? How do we get a handle on that?
Well, I think the main debate, the book that you're referring to in particular, is addressing in pre-state society, so looking at like hunting and gathering societies and the difference between when people form states, usually formed around agricultural civilization, versus when they live in hunting and gathering tribes. The short answer is that nobody knows. And so everybody pick partial data to support whatever they wanted to say. So the guy like Keeley in War Before Civilization, he picks every single example that point to an extremely violent past, say, you see, that's what the norm was. The next guy who instead wants to push a noble savage type of story where everybody in hunting and gathering tribes hug each other and live happily in peace and in harmony with nature will find all the pieces of evidence that support that. And there are. And will ignore all the stuff that a guy like Keeley will focus on and will come up with a completely different conclusion.
Keeley being the War Before Civilization author.
Exactly. I distrust anybody who has some neat and simple conclusions about anything, pretty much, because life is neither neat nor simple. Things are usually messy, contradictory. There's this, but also that. Is never, very rarely things are that black and white. Unfortunately, that's not how you sell books or anything else for that matter, because people like a simple thesis, something quick that they can gravitate to, and is like, oh, those guys back in hunting and gathering days were a bunch of barbarians, or those guys were the model for peaceful living and they were sweet and wonderful. The evidence I've seen is so, and I've studied this a lot, more than the average person, and I still have no idea what the answer is, because I find the evidence highly complicated, to say the least. Because depending on the time and the place, you find things that seem to point to both conclusions at the same time. Which is why I think people are able to draw these black and white parallels, just because there is something there to support it. It's just that they are also ignoring all the evidence against it.
So what would be evidence for, I'll be silly and say the rainbows and unicorns approach, where the noble savage lived in peace and never hurt anybody.
Well, like take for example, not even just hunting and gathering, right? Let's go even about bigger societies. Look at the Anasazi in the Southwest. They lived in the area of Arizona, New Mexico, southern Colorado, southern Utah. Farming civilization developed fairly large public architecture, buildings, villages, sometimes thousands of people living in one village. So, fairly well-developed society for the time, which was roughly basically about 1,000 years ago, give or take a few centuries. The first few centuries of their existence, you find hardly any evidence of violence. Their villages are not built for defensive purposes. They are very open. Could be easily attacked, but nobody's attacking them. So you're like, oh, these guys are wonderful, peaceful savage who did not practice any kind of warfare. And the very same people, later down the road, when things got harsher from an environmental standpoint and competition for resources become a lot more fierce and people are running low on supplies, the same place, the same people are now super violent. They are building their structure with defense as the primary purpose. You find a lot of evidence of nasty things being done to one another. And they are both true.
Those are those cliffside dwellings that are basically tucked underneath rock and very difficult to attack.
Exactly. And both of those things are true. They are the same people, same geography, same type of civilization, two different points in history. If you visited them in the year 700 or 800, 900 Common Era, you think these are the most peaceful people in the world. You visit them in the year 1200 and you think violence and warfare is the rule. Both are true. So, what are you going to make? That's why I don't like the simple conclusions, because it's trying to usually ignore one or these others. So that means that it's not that psychologically these guys are incapable of violence or that psychologically they are more bloodthirsty or more. When people have enough to eat, well, often they can be a lot nicer. When people don't have enough to eat, suddenly you remember that you don't like your neighbor that much anyway, and they have food and you don't, and you want to bash their skull in. Same thing with hunters and gatherers. I mean, hunters and gatherers lack a couple of the main reasons why people fight one another. They rarely ever fight over religion, because they don't have this worldview that require a competition between religious worldviews. They don't give a crap if you believe different stuff in the next tribe, so they don't fight over that. They don't fight because they want your stuff.
They can't carry that much stuff.
You can't. So there's no, it's like, great, I kill you, I steal your stuff, now I have to carry it. Doesn't work. I have only 2 hands, I don't have beasts of burden, makes no sense. So I'm not going to fight you to steal your stuff, and I'm not going to fight you over religion. There right there is 2 huge reasons why people fight one another. By the same token, they will fight over hunting territories. They will fight over, if the resources are scarce. That will be what it's about. So again, it's not that they are either completely peaceful or completely violent. It's true that they lack some of the things that make people go to war. And so in that sense, they are, quote unquote, more peaceful. But it's also true that they can be just as violent as anybody else when it comes to access to resources and hunting grounds.
Well, there are lots of examples of cultures that have gone from relatively peaceful to incredibly violent within 1 or 2 lifetimes in the modern era.
Absolutely.
And I mean, I'm a peaceful person, but if some group had murdered my children, I would become a very different person very, very quickly. And it wouldn't take much. I mean, the reality is it doesn't take much for cultures that have lived together peacefully, whether it was in Yugoslavia or late 1800s Germany, to then completely disintegrate and immediately start identifying other groups that are essentially to blame for all the misfortunes that one group is experiencing.
And one of the problems of the power that violence gives you is that it takes only one guy or one population or one group that you come in contact with to start playing the game and to use that power. It's kind of like the same thing we were saying about weight cutting or steroids. If nobody's doing it, then it's easy not to do it. But if somebody starts, you kind of have to as well in order to keep a competitive advantage and not just get crushed. You can't really be a pacifist in the middle of warrior cultures around you, because all that happens is that people will squash you. So you don't really have that option. If there were groups that said, we don't want to fight under all circumstances, well, you don't hear from them for very long because they get wiped out. So it's one of the things that once the context is set for fighting and violence, then it's very hard to undo it. It's very difficult, which is why, hunting and gathering in where everybody has a huge chunk of land and you don't really come in contact with one another, tribes, all that often. When you do come in contact, it's probably friendly. It's like, okay, we can trade with one another. It's a bad idea to sleep with your siblings, and I'm related to everyone in my tribe, so we can exchange mates, and I find someone hot in your tribe, you do in mine. It's a lot easier. But if suddenly the available land is not that much, and there's only so many good areas for hunting grounds, and we both want it, well, now we're going to kill each other over it,
Well, it's funny that you say, someone hot from your tribe, because if you take the DNA evidence, apparently it didn't even need to be of a different tribe. It could be of an entirely different species. That whole thing that Neanderthal DNA makes up something like 2 to 4% of European DNA means that my ancestors at some point thought that Neanderthal chick was pretty hot, and thus explaining this massive bony ridge above my eyes and my general Cro-Magnon appearance.
Yeah, I don't think, today we can tell that they are different species. I think back then you wouldn't even be able to tell. You're like, they are those people who look a little different from us, whatever.
And to be fair, without the DNA evidence, if you took, a pygmy skeleton and a Dutch skeleton and you put them in the dirt together, they would look like different species.
Yeah.
Until you did the DNA workup and all the other detailed anatomical stuff. So the human or the Homo family tree is continuously being revised. They're always finding new skeletons and new bits of the puzzle, and as the analytical techniques get better, it'll be really interesting to see eventually where it all settles out.
Yeah.
That period, or that fact that not that long ago that there was Homo sapiens and Homo neanderthalis, the Neanderthals, and the Denisovans, which were kind of I think they were the ancestors of the Australians. They were living up in Siberia. And then maybe this Homo florensis, these hobbits in Indonesia, and they were all there. We weren't the only Homo. We weren't the only human.
Yep, exactly. That's pretty crazy in itself.
Have you heard about this? You're from Italy. That's not that far from Spain. This pit of bones area in Spain where they found, I think, 28 individuals basically at the bottom of a pit, and many of them display signs of violence, like spears and axe wounds.
From when was it? How long ago?
500,000 years ago. Like 400,000 years ago. I'll send you the link. It's crazy.
Those people are not considered human even, as far as we
know. No, they're like Homo heidelbergensis.
Yeah, it's like predating the... Yeah. No, and that's what I mean, exactly. It's like, so somebody who has this theory of like, everybody before agriculture showed up, everybody was peaceful and mellow. No, that's not true either. It's the same way as arguing that before state society, everybody was monstrously violent and that's all they did. That's also oversimplifying stuff.
What about the argument that if you take just relatively recent history, the 1800s, the 1900s, the 2000s, and the beginning of the 21st century, where the data is better, that the 1900s was way more violent than the 1800s, and the other way around, that we're essentially been moving towards the most peaceful situation that we've been in recently, that even with the world wars in the 1900s, in the 20th century, that was still way more peaceful than the 1800s and the 19th century.
And I think it's interesting because we don't know how it's going to pan out. We're seeing it on a relatively short amount of time, because the fact is, yes, today, the odds of you dying because of violence throughout the world, including some messed up places where the incidence of violence is very high, are probably less than they were 150 years ago. At the same time, because we now have the technological capability of wiping out every single human being on Earth, that could change tomorrow, and suddenly the most peaceful time leads to a complete wipeout of humanity. So, it's kind of a flip of a coin in the sense that we don't really know whether it's an interesting trend, but the time span that we're looking at is a bit short to draw full conclusions on it.
Well, you could even make an argument that and I don't think I'm definitely not the first person to make this, that the thing that's made the late 20th and the early 21st century so much more peaceful is this capability to absolutely wipe everybody out. So we haven't seen the big wars between the great powers the way that we did in the early 20th century, in the 30-Year War, in the 100-Year War, in the Franco-Prussian War.
Then again, it only takes one guy to push the envelope and suddenly the war was leading. It's kind of like, the system of alliances in Europe before World War One was great to declare warfare, except if somebody ignores it and decides to start anyway. Now a local fight turns into a giant fight where everybody's bound to step in. It's kind of the same thing. It's a nice idea, but there's no guarantee that it's going to work long term. Which is kind of why I always go back to this idea. I'm fascinated with the notion, I call it gladiators for world peace. Anybody who wants to fight, anybody who has an issue, you hate one another, you are communist or Nazi, you are super, you're like in the Mossad, or you are with Hamas or something like that. It would be sweet to find a nice place away from everybody, big Coliseum-style arena, 20 of you against 20 of them, we hand you access, we have it on pay-per-view, and you don't involve any damn civilians in your fighting, Because that's the problem, that a huge chunk of the people who die in conflicts don't want to be in those conflicts. They are not there, or even when you see horrible things happen, when you look at the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union, they did horrible things to the civilian population. When the Soviets invaded Germany, they did horrible things to the German population. And there's this idea that it's revenge. It's not revenge. That poor lady that's getting gang raped by a bunch of people in the Red Army had nothing to do with the Nazi guy who put a bullet in your 3-year-old when they were invading your country. They're not the same people. They're not taking revenge on the same person. The 3-year-old was innocent as much as this lady is innocent. So, and I hate that stuff about a lot of conflicts, that so much of the misery and suffering that emerges is experienced by people who do not want to be part of that conflict.
And it's not even directly caused by people. It's things like almost, many of these giant fatality amounts, many of the civilians killed in Russia in World War II, was just plain starvation. So there's a complete disruption of anything that allowed the getting of food and crops to people who were starving.
Whereas if you want to have the contest between the armies, have it away from everybody. Have it seriously, like we'll all sit and have a beer watching on pay-per-view modern gladiators, have it at each other, and if you win the competition, you won the war. You got the better terms at the peace treaty.
Daniele Bolelli for president.
I agree. I think soon enough our conversation is going to be interrupted by the phone ringing, and it's going to be from Sweden offering me the Nobel Peace Prize for this genius idea.
Yeah, I think war for peace, although that does sound a little bit Orwellian. You've got to... Well, when people want to get a hold of you or want to get your stuff, what's the best way for them to do that?
A bunch of websites, I guess. I have a public Facebook page, so that's an easy way to reach me. I have the History on Fire podcast website. I have the Drunken Taoist podcast website. I think by now, in the digital age, it's easy enough that if you type somebody's name, you usually get a lot of whatever you want to know about them that they put out there, so that's easy enough. But yeah, Facebook public page is an easy way, because then if you have any question, I can just message me and I'll reply.
Well, thank you so much, Daniele. As always, it's been a fascinating conversation. I really enjoyed it, and I'm going to assume that other people are going to enjoy it at least as much as I have.
Cool, man. Thanks so much.
Take care.